"Mommy says you're my daddy," says the maid's son to the millionaire right in the middle of his late mother's estate. At first, he thinks it's a mistake, until he looks into the boy's eyes and sees something he never expected: himself. But when he confronts the boy's mother, the woman he once loved in secret, she denies everything. What is she hiding? And why did she disappear all those years ago? The truth behind their forbidden past could tear them apart, or give them the second chance they never thought they'd get. What really happened between the maid and the millionaire? And will one little boy's words change all their lives forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning fog hung like a gossamer veil over the magnolia trees, their waxy leaves dripping with dew. Daniel Whitmore stood at the iron gates of Whitmore Estate, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored suit. 7 years had stretched between his last visit and now, but the property remained unchanged, a testament to southern grandeur frozen in time. The crunch of gravel announced the arrival of Mr. Peterson, the estate manager, a man whose silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him the appearance of a kindly professor rather than a property caretaker. He shuffled forward, a ring of brass keys jangling in his weathered hands. "Mr. Whitmore," Peterson said, nodding respectfully, "my condolences about your mother." Daniel accepted the keys with a slight nod. "Thank you. Has anything been moved since?" "No, sir. Everything's exactly as Mrs. Whitmore left it. The staff maintained the grounds, but the house interior remains untouched." Peterson cleared his throat. "The property will need to be evaluated before we can proceed with any sale. There's quite a bit of history here." History. The word felt heavy in the morning air. Daniel turned the keys over in his palm, their cold metal bringing back memories he'd rather forget. "I'll need a few hours alone," Daniel said, his voice carrying the crisp authority that had served him well in countless boardrooms. "Of course, sir. I'll be in the groundskeeper's cottage if you need anything." Daniel waited until Peterson's footsteps faded before approaching the massive front door. The key slid into the lock with a familiar resistance. Inside, the foyer greeted him with its soaring ceiling and grand staircase, everything draped in sheets like pale ghosts. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he moved through the house. The piano room was first, sheet music still scattered across the bench as if waiting for the next lesson. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of light filtering through heavy curtains. His mother had insisted on weekly lessons, her voice sharp with disappointment when his fingers stumbled over the keys. In his father's study, leather-bound books lined the walls, their spines cracked with age. The leather chair behind the massive desk still held the impression of his father's form, though he'd been gone for 15 years now. A half-empty crystal decanter sat on a side table, the amber liquid inside turned cloudy with time. The kitchen hit him hardest. Memories flooded back of late-night conversations with Martha, the cook who'd slip him extra cookies when his mother wasn't looking. The copper pots still hung in their precise order, though their shine had dulled. Here, in this warm space so different from the formal rooms above, he'd found moments of peace. But it was his mother's presence that seemed to linger in every corner. He could almost hear the click of her heels on the hardwood, smell her expensive perfume, feel the weight of her disapproving gaze. The woman who had shaped his life through rigid expectations and carefully wielded disappointment. Daniel loosened his tie, suddenly feeling suffocated by the weight of the past. He made his way to the garden, where the fog had begun to lift, revealing the meticulously maintained roses and boxwoods. The koi pond drew him like a magnet, its surface a mirror reflecting the cloudy sky above. Here on a summer evening 7 years ago, he'd sat with Angela. Her laugh had echoed across the water as they dangled their feet in the pond, breaking every rule of proper behavior his mother had drilled into him. Angela's dark eyes had sparkled with a joy that made him forget about expectations and family names. She'd worn her hair in dozens of small braids then, each one catching the light as she moved. That was before his mother had discovered them, before the cruel words and threats, before he'd left for Europe, thinking distance would solve everything, before... The crunch of tires on gravel pulled him from his memories. Daniel checked his watch. barely afternoon. Peterson wasn't expecting any visitors. He made his way back to the front of the house, straightening his tie and composing his features into the mask of polite indifference that had served him well these past years. A modest sedan had parked in the circular drive. The driver's door opened, and Daniel's carefully constructed walls crumbled in an instant. Angela stepped out, as beautiful as she'd been 7 years ago, though her face held a new strength, a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. Her braided hair swayed as she walked around to the passenger side. Daniel's heart stopped when she opened the rear door. A small hand appeared first, followed by a boy who couldn't have been more than 6. The child looked up at the house with wide eyes that Daniel recognized from his own childhood photos. Angela guided the boy forward with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as they approached the front door. Daniel found himself moving to answer before they could knock, his fingers trembling slightly on the handle. When he pulled the door open, the 3 of them stood frozen in a tableau of unspoken words and buried history. Angela's face was composed, almost formal, though something flickered in her eyes when they met his. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady and professional, as if they were strangers meeting for the first time, as if they hadn't shared whispered dreams by the koi pond, as if she hadn't been the one person who saw past his carefully constructed facades. "I'm Angela Carter. I believe we have some matters to discuss." The boy looked between them, his small face serious and searching. Then, with the simple clarity that only children possess, he broke the tension with 5 words that shattered Daniel's world. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process Micah's words. The boy looked up at him with innocent curiosity, dark eyes that mirrored his own searching his face. Angela placed a protective hand on Micah's shoulder, her composure unwavering. "Perhaps we should step inside," she suggested, her voice carrying the same professional tone she'd maintained since arriving. "Yes, of course," Daniel managed, stepping back mechanically. His legs felt wooden as he gestured toward the grand living room. "Please, come in." Micah's eyes widened as they entered the vast space, taking in the crystal chandelier and the towering bookshelves that lined the walls. He clutched a worn sketchbook to his chest, his small fingers tracing its edges. "I'm here about a letter," Angela said, breaking the heavy silence. "Mr. Peterson mentioned that your mother left something for me with the estate lawyer." Daniel's hands clenched involuntarily. "A letter?" His voice cracked slightly. "I wasn't aware." "It was arranged before her passing." Angela's words were careful, measured. "The lawyer contacted me last week." Micah had already drifted away from them, drawn to a corner of the room where sunlight streamed through tall windows. He settled cross-legged on the Persian rug, opening his sketchbook and pulling a pencil from his pocket. Daniel watched the boy, his throat tight. "Angela, He struggled to find the right words. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years." "This isn't the time," Angela cut him off softly but firmly. Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward Micah, who was now absorbed in his drawing. "He's mine?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Angela's expression hardened slightly. "He's mine, Daniel. He has me. That's enough." "But I had a right to..." "To what?" Angela's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing a flash of old pain. "Your mother made it very clear what would happen if I stayed. You left for Europe without a backward glance." "I didn't know you were..." "Mr. Whitmore," Angela interrupted, her professional mask back in place. "I'm only here for the letter. Nothing more." Daniel fell silent, watching as Micah's pencil moved across the paper with surprising confidence for a child his age. The boy's tongue poked out slightly as he concentrated, his eyes darting up occasionally to study Daniel's face. Curious despite himself, Daniel moved closer to peek at the sketch, his breath caught in his throat. There, emerging on the paper, was his own face, or parts of it. Micah had started with his nose, capturing its slight angle with remarkable accuracy. The eyes were taking shape now, and Daniel recognized his own gaze staring back at him from the paper. "He's very talented," Daniel said softly. Angela's expression softened slightly as she watched her son. "Yes, he is. He sees things others miss." Daniel cleared his throat. I'll call Peterson about the letter. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed. The estate manager arrived promptly with a sealed envelope, handing it to Angela with a sympathetic smile. She tucked it into her purse without opening it. Thank you, she said, rising. Micah, honey, it's time to go. Already? Micah looked up from his drawing, disappointment clear on his face. But I'm not finished. Daniel surprised himself by speaking up. Would you both stay for dinner? Angela hesitated, but Micah jumped to his feet. Please, Mommy, just a little while. Something passed across Angela's face, concern, uncertainty, and perhaps a hint of softening. Micah, please? The boy's eyes were pleading. I want to finish my drawing. Angela sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. All right, just for dinner. Daniel ordered from a nearby restaurant that still delivered to the estate, and soon they were seated in the formal dining room. The chandelier cast warm light over the antique table, making the silver place settings gleam. Micah seemed fascinated by everything from the heavy curtains to the ornate ceiling moldings. But it was when he started talking about his latest project that Daniel felt his heart constrict. I'm building a robot, Micah announced, pushing his pasta around his plate. Well, trying to. It's supposed to move by itself, but I can't figure out the motor part yet. A robot? Daniel leaned forward, genuinely interested. Uh-huh. Mommy says my daddy used to make computers and stuff. Micah glanced at Daniel with shy curiosity. Did you really? Daniel nodded, his throat tight. I did. I still do, actually. I design apps and technology systems now. Angela's phone buzzed and she checked the screen with a slight frown. Excuse me for a moment, she said, standing. I need to take this call. As soon as she left the room, Micah reached for his sketchbook. Want to see something? He asked, flipping through the pages. Of course, Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Micah found the page he was looking for and turned the book around. Daniel's heart seemed to stop for a moment. There, drawn in a child's simple style, were 3 stick figures standing under a triangular roof. Above the drawing, in careful letters, were the words, Micah's house. But it was the figures themselves that made Daniel's hands shake. One was clearly Micah, small, with a big smile. Another was Angela, her braided hair detailed with careful lines. And the third figure, the one on the right, was unmistakably meant to be Daniel, down to the way he held himself and the shape of his eyes. Daniel stared at the drawing, unable to speak. His son, had drawn them as a family, under one roof, together. The morning sun cast long shadows across the estate's manicured lawn as Daniel stood at his mother's bedroom window. His fingers pressed against the cool glass, watching Angela guide Micah toward their car. The boy bounced along, still chattering about robots and drawings, while Angela moved with measured grace, checking his seatbelt with practiced care. Daniel's chest tightened as he watched them. They looked so natural together, a complete unit. His presence felt like an intrusion on their well-ordered world. Just as Angela closed Micah's door, she paused, her hand lingering on the handle. Her shoulders tensed, then relaxed as if coming to a decision. She turned and walked back toward the house with purposeful steps. Daniel's heart quickened. He hurried downstairs, reaching the front door just as she knocked. When he opened it, Angela stood straight-backed, her expression carefully neutral. I need to say something, she began, her voice steady but firm. Last night was nice for Micah. But don't confuse kindness for invitation. Micah has a life. We're doing fine. The words hit Daniel like physical blows, though he tried not to show it. He nodded, unable to find his voice. Goodbye, Mr. Whitmore, she said, turning away before he could respond. Daniel watched until their car disappeared down the winding driveway, leaving only dust and silence in its wake. Her words echoed in his mind as he walked through the quiet house, eventually finding himself at the door of his mother's study. The room smelled of old paper and leather untouched since her passing. Dust motes danced in the morning light as Daniel pushed open the heavy oak door. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The antique desk centered perfectly on the Persian rug. The the walls lined with built-in shelves holding leather-bound books and family photographs. He began clearing the desk methodically, trying to lose himself in the task. Each drawer revealed layers of his mother's life, carefully organized correspondence, pristine stationery she'd never use, fountain pens arranged by color. In a silver frame, he found a photo of himself at graduation, standing stiffly beside his mother. He remembered that day, remembered Angela watching from the crowd, though his mother never knew. The bottom drawer was locked. Daniel found the key in an ornate box on the bookshelf, right where she'd always kept it. Inside the drawer, beneath a stack of legal documents, lay a single cream-colored envelope. His name was written across it in his mother's elegant script. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he lifted it, but he didn't open it. Not yet. He needed air, needed to think. The small cafe in town hadn't changed in 7 years. The same bell chimed as he pushed open the door. The same scent of coffee and fresh-baked cookies filled the air. Daniel ordered black coffee and found a quiet corner table, the envelope burning a hole in his jacket pocket. Daniel Whitmore, as I live and breathe. He looked up to find Mrs. Henderson, their old neighbor, beaming down at him. Her hair had gone completely white, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Mrs. Henderson," he smiled, standing to greet her. "It's been a long time." "Too long," she agreed, patting his arm. "I was sorry to hear about your mother, though I suppose you're here about the estate." Her eyes took on a knowing look. "I saw Angela Carter's car up there yesterday. Didn't think she'd come back after what happened. Brave girl." Daniel's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean, what happened?" Mrs. Henderson's expression turned coy. "Oh, ancient history now, I'm sure." She glanced at her watch. "Goodness, I'm late for bridge. Take care, Daniel." She hurried away before he could press further, leaving him with more questions than answers. The suspicion that had been growing since Angela's return now gnawed at him relentlessly. What exactly had happened 7 years ago? His mother's version had been simple. Angela had left suddenly, no explanation given. But there had always been gaps in that story, things that didn't quite add up. That night, Daniel sat in his childhood bedroom, unable to sleep. The envelope from his mother's desk lay on the bedside table, taunting him. Finally, at just past midnight, he reached for it with trembling fingers. The paper was expensive, heavy stock, his mother's preferred stationery. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. As he read his mother's elegant handwriting, the blood drained from his face. "My dearest Daniel, by the time you read this, I will be gone and certain truths must be told. I've always done what I believed was best for you, for our family name and your future. Sometimes protecting those we love requires difficult choices. That girl, Angela, would have taken everything from you. Your future, your reputation, your inheritance. I did what I had to do. I won't apologize for protecting you even now. But perhaps I owe you the truth at least. Enclosed, you'll find the check I wrote to her. She never cashed it. Her pride wouldn't let her, I suppose. Or perhaps it was something else. Remember that everything I did for you. With love, Mother." Daniel's hands shook as he turned the envelope upside down. A personal check fluttered out, made out to Angela Carter for a sum that made his stomach turn. The date was from 7 years ago. The check had never been cashed. He stared at his mother's signature on the check, the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving finally starting to fall into place. The timing of Angela's departure, his mother's insistence that he take that job in Europe, the way the staff had stopped meeting his eyes in those final days before he left. His mother's words seemed to float off the page. "I did what I had to do." The morning dew still clung to the grass when Daniel heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He'd spent hours rehearsing what to say, but now that Angela's car was pulling up, his carefully planned words scattered like leaves in the wind. Micah burst from the car first, his backpack bouncing against his small frame as he waved enthusiastically. "Hi, Mr. Daniel." Angela emerged more slowly, her expression guarded. She wore a simple blue dress that caught the morning light, her braids pulled back neatly. "You said you found more documents?" Her tone was professional, distant. "Yes," Daniel managed, stepping aside to let them in. "Thank you for coming." Micah was already eyeing the back door. "Can I go see the fish again?" "Please, Mommy." Angela hesitated, then nodded. "Stay where I can see you from the window." "I will," Micah called over his shoulder, already halfway to the door. They watched through the kitchen window as he settled by the koi pond, pulling out his ever-present sketchbook and colored pencils. "Would you like some tea?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I found my mother's old Earl Grey in the pantry." Angela paused, then gave a slight nod. "Thank you." The kitchen felt smaller than Daniel remembered as he moved around it, filling the kettle, reaching for cups. Angela stood near the window, keeping watch over Micah. The morning sun caught her profile, and for a moment Daniel was transported back 7 years, to other mornings, other cups of tea, when the world had seemed simpler. "He loves to draw," Angela said softly, breaking the silence. "Gets lost in it for hours." "Like you used to," Daniel replied before he could stop himself. Angela's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "You said there were documents?" Daniel set the steeping tea on the counter. "Yes, but that's not entirely true." He took a deep breath. "I found something else. Something you should see." Finally, she turned to face him. Her eyes were wary, but she didn't move away when he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the envelope. "It's from my mother," he explained, placing it on the counter between them. "I found it yesterday." Angela didn't reach for it immediately. She studied his face first, as if searching for some hidden agenda. Then, slowly, she picked up the envelope and removed its contents. Daniel watched as she read, saw the exact moment the words registered. Her hands didn't shake, but her knuckles went white against the paper. When she reached the check, she let out a small, bitter laugh. "So now you know," she said, laying the letter back on the counter as if it might burn her. "Not everything," Daniel replied quietly. "Please, Angela, tell me what happened." She was silent for so long he thought she might refuse. Outside, they could hear Micah humming to himself as he drew. Finally, Angela wrapped her arms around herself and spoke. "Your mother called me to her study one afternoon. You were at work. She'd found out about us, about the baby." Angela's voice was controlled, but Daniel could hear the old pain beneath it. "She had a whole file on my family, my scholarship history, everything. She said she could make sure I never worked as a nurse in this state again, that she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of girl I really was." Daniel felt sick. "Angela, She held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me finish. Please." She took a deep breath. "She wrote that check right in front of me, said it would be enough to start fresh somewhere else. When I refused, she got cold, said she'd make sure I was erased, that no one would believe me about the baby being yours, that she'd protect the Whitmore name at any cost." Angela finally looked at him directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst was how she talked about our child, like it was a problem to be solved, a stain to be removed. She never once said baby or grandchild, just it and that situation. Her voice cracked slightly. "I knew right then I couldn't stay. I wouldn't raise a black son in a house that never saw me as human." The truth of her words hit Daniel like physical blows. He gripped the counter to steady himself. "I didn't take her money," Angela continued, stronger now. "I took my son. I took my life. I wasn't going to be someone's secret." She squared her shoulders. "So I left. Found a job in another city. Built a life for us, a good life." Daniel struggled to find words. All these years, he'd carried a story in his head about why Angela left. But this was so much worse than he'd imagined, and so much simpler. It wasn't just about him or even about them. It was about dignity, about survival. "I'm so sorry," he finally managed, knowing how inadequate the words were. "Mommy, Mr. Daniel," Micah's voice carried through the window. "Come look," I finished. They both turned to see Micah holding up his sketchbook, beaming with pride. Through the window, they could see his latest creation. 3 figures holding hands, drawn with a child's loving attention to detail. Daniel recognized himself in the tallest figure standing next to Angela, with Micah between them. Angela moved to the window, her hand pressing against the glass. She looked at the drawing, then at Daniel. Her expression was unreadable, but she made no move to leave. Instead, she picked up her untouched tea and took a small sip, her eyes never leaving their son's joyful face. The morning light streamed through the window, warming the space between them, as Micah continued to wave his drawing, waiting for their response. The early morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the marble countertops. Angela stood at the stove, waiting for the kettle to boil, her mind racing despite her outward calm. She hadn't planned on staying the night, but Daniel's quiet insistence and Micah's pleading eyes had worn down her defenses. Now here she was, padding around the kitchen she'd once known so well, trying to ignore how familiar it all felt. The kettle began to whistle just as Daniel walked in, his hair slightly mussed from sleep, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. He stopped short when he saw her, as if surprised to find her real and not a figment of his imagination. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. Angela nodded, turning back to the kettle. "There's enough hot water if you'd like some tea." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle clink of cups against saucers and the distant chirping of morning birds. Daniel moved carefully around her to reach for the coffee grounds, maintaining a respectful distance that felt both necessary and painful. The quiet was shattered by the sound of running feet, and suddenly Micah burst into the kitchen, his small body swimming in one of Daniel's old t-shirts that reached past his knees. His hair stuck up at odd angles and his face was lit with excitement. "Look, I'm a scientist now," he declared, walking with exaggerated robot movements. "Beep, boop. I'm programming computers like Daddy used to." Daniel's laugh burst out, genuine and surprised, filling the kitchen with unexpected warmth. "Those are some impressive robot moves you've got there, buddy." Angela couldn't help the softening of her expression as she watched Micah parade around the kitchen, making mechanical noises and pretending to compute complex calculations. But she quickly schooled her features back to neutrality when she caught Daniel watching her. "Mommy, can we stay and look at more books?" Micah asked, abandoning his robot persona to tug at her sleeve. "Please? Mr. Daniel's library is huge." Angela hesitated, looking between her son's hopeful face and Daniel's carefully neutral expression. "Well, the weekend's coming up," Daniel offered quietly. "There's plenty of organizing to do in the library. Could use an expert helper." "I'm an expert," Micah bounced on his toes. "I organized all my books at home by color and size." Angela set her tea down slowly. The responsible thing would be to leave, to maintain the boundaries she'd worked so hard to establish. But watching Micah's excitement, seeing how naturally he gravitated toward Daniel, "I suppose we could stay through the weekend," she said finally, "to help with the books." "Yes." Micah pumped his fist in the air, then ran off, presumably to get dressed. "He's obsessed with your library," Angela explained, not quite meeting Daniel's eyes. "He gets that from you, I guess." Daniel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," he said simply, "for staying." Throughout the day, Angela found herself watching Daniel and Micah work together in the library. They'd developed an efficient system. Daniel would pull books from the shelves while Micah sorted them into piles based on their covers and subjects. Every so often, Micah would discover something fascinating, and Daniel would pause to explain it to him, their heads bent together over the pages. "Look at this one," Micah exclaimed, holding up a large volume about space exploration. "It has real pictures from the moon." "That's right," Daniel said, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him. "Did you know your grandmother, my mom, actually met an astronaut once?" "Really?" Micah's eyes went wide. "Really? She was at a conference in Houston." Daniel launched into the story, and Angela watched as Micah hung on every word, his expression a mirror of Daniel's own look of concentration she remembered so well from their younger days. The anger that had been Angela's constant companion for 7 years began to feel different, less sharp around the edges. In its place was something more complicated, uncertainty, possibility, fear. She watched as Daniel showed Micah how to carefully handle the older books, explaining about delicate pages and proper storage. Her son soaked it all in, asking questions that Daniel answered with infinite patience. As the afternoon light began to fade, they ordered pizza and ate it picnic style on the library floor, surrounded by stacks of sorted books. Micah fell asleep shortly after, curled up on a reading chair with a book about robots still open on his lap. Angela continued sorting through books while Daniel carried Micah up to bed. When she pulled out a thick volume about garden design, something slipped from between its pages and fluttered to the floor. She bent to pick it up and froze. It was a Polaroid photograph, its colors slightly faded but still clear. In it, she and Daniel were standing by the garden fence, caught in a moment of shared laughter. She remembered that day, the late summer heat, the smell of blooming jasmine, the way Daniel had been telling her about some ridiculous coding mishap at work. But she hadn't known anyone had captured the moment on film. In the photo, her head was thrown back in laughter, and Daniel was looking at her with such open adoration it made her chest ache. They looked so young, so unaware of what was coming. Angela stared at the image for a long time, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. Finally, after glancing toward the doorway to make sure she was alone, she slipped the Polaroid into her pocket, feeling its weight like a secret against her hip. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, accompanied by the distinct smell of burning batter and the sound of childish giggles. Daniel stood at the stove, a spatula in one hand, and a look of determination on his face as he stared down at yet another blackened pancake. Micah sat at the kitchen counter, doubled over with laughter. "That one looks like a meteorite," Micah declared, wiping tears from his eyes. "Can we keep it as a science experiment?" Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair, leaving a streak of flour across his forehead. "I swear I followed the recipe exactly," he muttered, examining the smoking pan with bewilderment. The smell of burnt breakfast drew Angela to the kitchen. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. Flour dusting every surface, batter drips creating abstract patterns on the counter, and a stack of what could generously be called well-done pancakes beside the stove. A smile tugged at her lips despite her best efforts to maintain her usual composure. "Mommy," Micah called out, still giggling. "Mr. Daniel's making moon rocks for breakfast." "I can see that," Angela said, her voice tinged with amusement. She moved toward the stove, gently taking the spatula from Daniel's hand. "Here, let me help before you set off the smoke alarms." Daniel stepped back, looking both relieved and embarrassed. "I used to be able to make these," he defended weakly. "At least I thought I did." "That was probably boxed mix," Angela said, quickly cleaning the pan and starting fresh. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting the heat and testing the surface with a drop of water. "Micah and I make these from scratch every Sunday, don't we, baby?" "Yeah, Mommy makes the best pancakes in the whole world," Micah declared loyally. "Sometimes she puts chocolate chips in them that look like little faces." Soon the kitchen filled with the proper smell of breakfast cooking. They gathered around the table, Micah perched between them, his plate stacked with perfectly golden pancakes. He drowned them in syrup while chattering enthusiastically about his latest interests. "Did you know that octopuses have 3 hearts?" he asked, fork waving in the air. "And they're super smart too. They can solve puzzles and escape from tanks and everything." "Is that so?" Daniel leaned forward, genuinely interested. "What else do you know about them?" "Well, they can change colors to match anything around them," Micah continued, clearly delighted to have such an attentive audience. "I want to invent something like that someday, like a suit that can change colors, then you could hide anywhere." Angela watched as Daniel asked thoughtful follow-up questions, drawing out more of Micah's knowledge about marine life and his inventive ideas. He wasn't just humoring the boy, he was fully engaged, offering suggestions and sharing his own knowledge when relevant. It was so different from how her own dates had responded to Micah's endless curiosity, with patronizing smiles and quick subject changes. After breakfast, they wandered out to the sprawling field behind the estate. The late morning sun had burned away the dew, leaving the grass warm and inviting. Daniel disappeared into the house briefly. returning with a stack of old ledger papers. "Watch this," he said to Micah, sitting cross-legged in the grass. His fingers moved with precision as he folded one of the pages, creating crisp lines and sharp angles. Micah watched, fascinated, as the paper transformed into a sleek airplane. "Now you try," Daniel encouraged, handing Micah a sheet. He guided the boy's smaller hands through the folds, explaining each step patiently. Angela hung back, phone in hand, capturing quiet moments. Micah's look of concentration, Daniel's gentle corrections, their shared smiles of triumph when Micah's plane finally took shape. They spent the next hour launching their creations into the air, racing them across the field and comparing flight patterns. Angela found herself taking more photos than she'd intended, trying to be subtle about capturing the joy on Micah's face as he chased after the planes, the way Daniel's eyes crinkled when he laughed. During a break in the action, while Micah was busy designing a super plane with multiple wings, Daniel moved to sit near Angela in the shade of an old oak tree. "How have you been?" he asked softly. "Really?" Angela was quiet for a moment, watching Micah work. "Busy," she finally said. "Nursing school wasn't easy, especially with a toddler, but we made it work. Night shifts meant I could be there for him during the day, even if I was running on coffee and willpower half the time." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He's amazing," he said. "You've done an incredible job with him." "I had to," Angela replied, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "I had to be twice as careful, twice as prepared. He's not allowed to make mistakes the way you were, Daniel. One wrong move, one bad day. That's all it takes for people to stop seeing him as a child who needs protection and start seeing him as a threat." She watched the understanding dawn in Daniel's eyes, the way he looked at Micah with new awareness. "I worry every time he leaves the house," she continued. "I've had to teach him things no 7-year-old should have to know. How to keep his hands visible, how to speak softly, when to call me immediately." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, broken only by Micah's delighted shout as his latest plane design took flight. Later that evening, after they'd tucked an exhausted Micah into bed, Daniel found Angela on the back porch. The night air was thick with the sound of crickets and the occasional distant call of an owl. He handed her a steaming cup of tea, chamomile with honey just as she'd always liked it, and settled into the chair beside her. They sat in companionable silence watching fireflies dance across the darkened field where they'd spent the afternoon. The tea warmed Angela's hands as she cradled the cup, its familiar comfort at odds with the uncertainty in her heart. "I didn't know," Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to. I want to learn everything I missed." Angela didn't respond, but she remained in her seat, letting the cricket song fill the space between them as she sipped her tea. The morning sun cast long shadows across the estate's gravel driveway as Daniel's car pulled away, leaving small dust clouds in its wake. Angela watched from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a warm coffee mug. She didn't need to ask where he was going. The quiet determination in his eyes at breakfast had said enough. "Mommy, can we explore outside?" Micah's voice pulled her attention away from the disappearing vehicle. He stood beside her, already dressed in his favorite dinosaur t-shirt and worn sneakers. "Sure, baby." Angela smiled, setting down her mug. "Let's see what we can find." They stepped out into the warm morning air, following an old brick path that wound through the sprawling grounds. Micah ran ahead, stopping to examine interesting rocks and fallen leaves, while Angela took in the changes 7 years had brought to the once manicured estate. The stable buildings stood weathered but proud, their red paint fading and peeling. Micah pressed his face against a dusty window, peering into the empty stalls. "Did they have horses here?" he asked, his breath fogging the glass. "They did," Angela replied, running her hand along the rough wooden door. "Beautiful ones. I used to watch them from the kitchen window while I worked." They continued their exploration, discovering garden patches now wild with weeds. Tomato vines grew tangled with morning glories, and forgotten rose bushes stretched their thorny branches toward the sky. Angela remembered these gardens in their prime, neat rows of vegetables, carefully tended flower beds, everything in its proper place. "Look, Mommy!" Micah called out, pointing to a butterfly perched on an overgrown lantana bush. "It's orange and black, like Halloween." Meanwhile, across town, Daniel sat in the sterile waiting room of the medical clinic, his knee bouncing slightly as he waited. He'd wrapped Micah's toothbrush carefully in tissue paper that morning, trying not to think too hard about what he was doing. A nurse called his name, leading him to a small examination room. She had kind eyes above her surgical mask as she explained the procedure. "The results should be ready in about 48 hours, she said, preparing to take his sample. "We'll call you as soon as they're in." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he managed. When he returned to the estate, he found Angela and Micah by the koi pond, sitting cross-legged on the stone edge. They were taking turns tossing small, flat stones across the water's surface, counting the skips before each one sank. "3!" Micah exclaimed as his stone bounced across the pond. "Did you see that?" "Pretty impressive," Daniel said, approaching them. Micah beamed up at him, holding out a stone. "Want to try? Mommy showed me how to pick the flat ones." Daniel accepted the stone, studying its smooth surface before sending it skipping across the water. 4 bounces before it disappeared beneath the surface. "Show off," Angela murmured, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice. They spent the afternoon by the pond, teaching Micah the fine art of stone skipping. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, before they headed inside for dinner. The evening meal was simple: pasta with sauce from a jar, garlic bread that came from the freezer. They ate quietly, the clink of forks against plates filling the silence. Micah was unusually subdued, tired from the day's adventures. After Micah had cleared his plate and wandered off to draw, Daniel set down his fork. "I went to the clinic today," he said softly, meeting Angela's eyes across the table, "for a paternity test." Angela's hand stilled around her water glass, but her expression remained calm. Daniel continued, choosing his words carefully. "I want to make sure he's protected, legally. I want to do this right." Angela was quiet for a long moment, studying the condensation beading on her glass. "You don't need a test to be his father," she finally said, her voice carrying the weight of years of single parenthood. She wasn't angry, just tired and honest. "I know," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the kitchen cleaned, Daniel walked past the living room and noticed a small figure curled up on the couch. Micah had fallen asleep there, his favorite sketchbook resting on his chest like a paper blanket. Daniel moved closer, intending to carry him to bed, when a drawing caught his eye. The page showed 2 figures wearing matching capes, standing tall against what appeared to be a crayon-drawn sky. One was clearly Micah, and the other, Daniel's breath caught as he recognized himself, rendered in a child's careful strokes. Below the drawing, in Micah's earnest handwriting, were the words, "My dad builds rockets and loves pancakes." Daniel stood there staring at those simple words until they blurred before his eyes. His throat tightened with emotion as he carefully lifted the sleeping boy, holding him close as he carried him upstairs to bed. The morning sun streamed through the estate's tall windows, casting long golden rectangles across Daniel's desk. His laptop hummed softly as he refreshed his email for what felt like the 100th time. When the new message finally appeared, "Medical results available." His finger hesitated over the mousepad. The room felt suddenly too quiet, too still. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he clicked the email open. The medical letterhead appeared crisp and official on his screen, followed by rows of technical terminology and percentages. His eyes scanned quickly until they found what they were looking for: probability of paternity 99.9%. Daniel's hands began to shake, but not from fear or anxiety. A warmth spread through his chest, something like joy mixed with relief and 1,000 other emotions he couldn't name. He read the results again, then a third time, letting the truth of it sink in. Through the window, he could see Angela sitting under the big oak tree in the backyard. She was watching Micah, who lay on his stomach in the grass, concentrated on his latest drawing. The morning light filtered through the leaves above them, creating shifting patterns on their faces. Daniel stood up from his desk, his legs slightly unsteady. He made his way outside, the dewy grass dampening his shoes as he crossed the lawn. Angela looked up as he approached, her expression questioning but not worried. She seemed to read something in his face because she straightened slightly, adjusting her position against the tree trunk. He lowered himself to sit beside her, close but not too close. For a moment, they both watched Micah, who was humming to himself as he colored, completely absorbed in his artwork. "It's confirmed," Daniel said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Angela nodded, her eyes still on Micah. "I already knew," she replied, just as quietly. The morning sunlight caught the moisture in her eyes, making them shine, but she didn't cry. She turned to look at Daniel directly. "Now what?" Daniel watched as Micah switched colored pencils, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Now I learn to be the father he thinks I already am." Angela's expression softened slightly and she nodded again, turning back to watch their son. Later that afternoon, Micah was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by school papers and artwork he'd brought from home. Daniel sat cross-legged beside him, examining each piece with genuine interest. "And this one," Micah said excitedly, pulling out a science project report, "is about the solar system. I got an A because I knew all the planets and drew them really good. See?" He pointed to his carefully drawn illustrations of each planet. "These are excellent," Daniel said, studying the detailed rings around Saturn. "You really captured the colors well." "There's a science fair coming up next month," Micah mentioned, trying to sound casual, but his eyes sparkled with hope. "We're supposed to make something cool." Daniel glanced at Angela, who stood in the doorway watching them. "Would it be okay if I came to see it?" he asked her. Angela's face remained neutral, but her voice was gentle when she answered, "I think that would be fine." Micah's face lit up like a firework. "Really? You'll come?" He scrambled to his feet and ran to his backpack, pulling out more papers. "I have all my other stuff too. Want to see my math test? I got all the multiplication right." For the next hour, Daniel went through every assignment, every art project, every gold star sticker Micah had earned. He asked questions, made observations, and watched as his son's excitement grew with each shared achievement. As evening approached, Angela ordered pizza for dinner, a treat that made Micah bounce with joy. After they'd eaten, Micah discovered an old Monopoly board in one of the study cabinets. "Can we play? Please?" he begged, already setting up the board on the living room rug. They gathered around the game, Angela taking the Scotty dog piece, Daniel the top hat, and Micah proudly choosing the race car. The game filled the house with sounds that had been absent for years: genuine laughter, playful accusations of cheating, groans of mock despair when landing on expensive properties. "You're going bankrupt," Micah declared gleefully as Daniel landed on boardwalk with a hotel. "Have mercy on your poor father," Daniel pleaded dramatically, counting out his remaining play money. Angela couldn't help but laugh at their antics, even as she quietly dominated the game with her careful property management. The sound of their combined laughter echoed off the high ceilings, filling the once silent rooms with warmth. When Micah finally began yawning, Angela announced it was bedtime. He protested weakly, but his drooping eyes betrayed his exhaustion. After changing into his pajamas and brushing his teeth, he climbed into bed in the guest room that was starting to feel like his own. Angela sat on the edge of his bed, tucking the covers around him the way she had every night since he was born. Micah's eyes were heavy with sleep, but he smiled up at her. "I like Daddy," he whispered, his voice soft and sincere. Angela felt something shift in her heart, a wall she'd built years ago beginning to crumble. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to his forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "I know," she whispered back, and then, so quietly she almost couldn't hear herself, "I think I do too." The morning sunlight painted the kitchen in warm honey tones as Angela made her way downstairs. She paused at the doorway, surprised by the sight before her. Daniel stood at the stove, spatula in hand, expertly flipping a golden brown pancake. The kitchen smelled of butter, vanilla, and fresh coffee. a far cry from the burnt disaster of days before. He looked up as she entered, offering a small but genuine smile. "Good morning. Coffee's ready if you'd like some." Angela nodded, moving to the coffee pot with practiced ease. The morning silence felt different today, comfortable rather than strained. Upstairs, Micah's soft snores could still be heard through the old house's vents. "You've improved your pancake technique," she observed, watching as he slid another perfect circle onto a growing stack. Daniel chuckled softly. "YouTube tutorials at midnight couldn't sleep, so I figured I might as well learn to feed my son properly." The casual way he said "my son" made something flutter in Angela's chest, but she kept her expression neutral as she added cream to her coffee. She settled at the kitchen island, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "How did you do it?" Daniel asked suddenly, his voice soft but clear. When Angela raised an eyebrow, he continued, "All of it. Raising him. Building a life. I want to know everything I missed." Angela took a slow sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. The morning light caught the silver threads in Daniel's dark hair, threads that hadn't been there 7 years ago. "Nursing school wasn't the plan," she began, her voice steady. "But I needed something stable, something that would let me provide for him. Night classes while my neighbor watched him. Double shifts at the diner between clinical rotations." She paused, remembering those exhausting years. "Some nights, I'd come home so tired I could barely think straight, but Micah would be waiting up, wanting to show me his latest drawing or tell me about his day. That kept me going." Daniel turned off the stove, moving to sit across from her. His full attention was on her words, his eyes clear and focused. No interruptions, no defensive posture, just listening. "The hardest part wasn't the bills, though those were bad enough," Angela continued. "It was watching him grow up in a world that kept trying to put him in boxes before he could even speak. Teachers who called him disruptive when he was just excited about learning. Store security following us in toy stores. I had to be his armor. I couldn't afford to break." She took another sip of coffee, steadying herself. "I taught him to be proud, to stand tall, but I also had to teach him things no child should have to learn. How to act around police. Why some people might treat him differently. When to speak up and when to..." She trailed off, then added quietly, "I had to make him strong without making him hard." "Did you ever..." Daniel hesitated, then pressed on. "Did you ever think about reaching out? To me?" Angela's eyes met his, unflinching. Every time he asked who his daddy was, every time he came home from school after Father's Day celebrations, every time he built something clever and I saw you in his hands, his focus. She set down her mug carefully. "But I wouldn't let him be anyone's secret. Not like I was." Daniel absorbed this, his face a mixture of pain and understanding. "You protected him. From everything. Including me." "Including your mother," Angela corrected gently. "Including a world that would have seen him as a scandal before seeing him as a child." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet thundering down the stairs. Micah burst into the kitchen, his hair wild from sleep, wearing his now favorite oversized science t-shirt of Daniel's. "Pancakes!" he exclaimed, climbing onto a stool. "Did Daddy learn how to not burn them?" The morning shifted into a busy day of estate organizing and Micah's endless questions about every object they encountered. By dinner time, Micah had insisted on helping set the table, carefully placing 3 plates instead of their usual 2. "There," he declared, standing back to admire his work. "It's perfect." "It's very nice, baby," Angela said, adjusting a slightly crooked fork. Micah shook his head, his expression serious. "No, it's perfect because it's not Mommy's house or Daddy's house anymore." He gestured to the table proudly. "It's Micah's house." Angela and Daniel's eyes met across the table, a complex mixture of emotions passing between them. Amusement at their son's declaration, heartbreak for the years lost, and something else, something uncertain but hopeful. Later, after dinner had been cleared and Micah was absorbed in drawing at the coffee table, Daniel and Angela stood on the back porch. The setting sun painted the sky in deep purples and oranges, casting long shadows across the garden. Daniel turned to Angela, his expression open and vulnerable. "Would you consider staying? Longer, I mean." When Angela didn't immediately respond, he hurried on. "Not as the maid. Not as a guest. Just as Micah's mom." He paused, gathering courage. "And maybe something more." Angela stood very still, watching the last rays of sunlight play across the garden where she had once walked as a younger woman, full of different dreams. She didn't answer yet, but she didn't say no. The morning sun streamed through the guest room windows as Angela helped Micah into his navy blue polo shirt. Her fingers worked quickly, smoothing down his collar and tucking in the edges with practiced precision. "Hold still, baby," she murmured, brushing a piece of lint from his shoulder. Micah bounced on his toes, practically vibrating with excitement. "Is Daddy really coming to my school?" he asked for the third time that morning. His eyes sparkled with anticipation as Angela straightened his jeans. "Yes, if you can stay still long enough for me to get you dressed," she replied, fighting back a smile. She ran a comb through his curls one last time, her movements gentle but efficient. A soft knock on the doorframe made them both look up. Daniel stood there in a crisp white button-down and dark slacks, his car keys jingling nervously in his hand. "The car's ready whenever you are," he said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "I thought maybe we could all ride together." Angela paused, her hands still resting on Micah's shoulders. The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Going together meant being seen together. It meant questions, assumptions, curious glances, and whispered conversations. Micah looked up at her with hopeful eyes. "Please, Mommy, can we go with Daddy?" Angela took a deep breath, then nodded. "Okay, just let me grab my purse." The drive to Micah's elementary school was quiet, filled only with Micah's excited chatter about his classroom and his friends. Angela sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar streets pass by through the window of Daniel's expensive car. She could feel the curious stares of other parents as they pulled into the school parking lot, the sleek black vehicle standing out among the usual minivans and SUVs. Daniel parked near the front entrance, and Micah was unbuckled and bouncing by the door before either adult could move. As they walked toward the building, Angela noticed the subtle double takes from other parents. She recognized their expressions, the quick glances between Daniel and Micah, the raised eyebrows at seeing them together, the whispered conversations behind cupped hands. But Daniel seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on Micah as they entered the school building. The hallways were decorated with student artwork and science projects, and Micah pulled them along eagerly, pointing out his contributions. Look, that's my drawing," Micah exclaimed, tugging Daniel's hand toward a wall covered in colorful family portraits. "See? That's us." Daniel stepped closer to examine the crayon drawing. 3 figures stood under a bright yellow sun. One tall figure with brown skin and curly hair labeled Mommy, a smaller figure in the middle marked Me, and another tall figure with lighter skin labeled My Dad, He's Learning. Angela watched as Daniel's fingers traced the edge of the paper, his expression soft and wondering. She saw him swallow hard before turning to Micah with a smile. "This is wonderful, buddy. You're quite the artist." Inside Micah's classroom, their son transformed into an enthusiastic tour guide. He showed Daniel his desk, his cubby, and the class pet, a hamster named Einstein. When they reached the science corner, Micah's excitement peaked. "This is my volcano," he declared proudly, pointing to a papier-mâché creation painted in swirling reds and browns. "We learned about chemical reactions and everything." Daniel knelt beside him, rolling up his sleeves to get a better look at the project. Within minutes, his pristine white shirt was marked with traces of glue and paint as he helped Micah demonstrate how the volcano worked. He asked questions about the process, listening intently as Micah explained each step with growing confidence. Angela stood back, watching them together. There was something about seeing Daniel on his knees, dress clothes forgotten, completely absorbed in Micah's world that made her heart twist in her chest. A small smile tugged at her lips as she watched them huddle over the project, their heads bent together in identical poses of concentration. "Ms. Carter?" A voice beside her made Angela turn. Mrs. Thompson, Micah's teacher, stood there with a warm smile. Could I speak with you for a moment? Angela nodded, following the teacher to a quiet corner of the classroom. She braced herself, years of parent-teacher conferences having taught her to expect the worst. But Mrs. Thompson's smile remained genuine. I just wanted to tell you, Micah's been doing wonderfully these past few weeks. There's been such a positive change in his behavior and focus. Really? Angela asked, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The teacher nodded. He's always been bright, but lately he's been more engaged, more confident. He's participating more in class discussions, turning in all his assignments. She glanced over at where Daniel and Micah were still examining the volcano. Whatever's happening at home, it's good for him. I haven't seen him this happy and settled all year. Angela felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. She watched as Daniel helped Micah carefully pack up his volcano, their movements in sync despite their newness to each other. Thank you, she said softly. That means a lot. As the open house drew to a close, they made their way back through the now quieter hallways. Micah skipped ahead, clutching his volcano carefully in both hands. At the school entrance, he stopped and waited for his parents to catch up. Daniel reached for Micah's hand automatically, his larger fingers wrapping protectively around their son's smaller ones. Without hesitation, Micah reached out with his free hand and grabbed Angela's, pulling her closer. Together, they walked across the parking lot toward Daniel's car. Their shadows stretched long in the late afternoon sun, merging into a single silhouette. Mother, father, child. A family shape, even if they hadn't spoken that word aloud yet. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the estate's tall windows when the sharp crunch of tires on gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Daniel looked up from where he sat helping Micah with his math homework at the kitchen table, his brow furrowing at the sound of a car door slamming. He exchanged a quick glance with Micah, whose pencil paused mid-equation. Through the window, he spotted a sleek black Mercedes pulling up to the front of the house. His stomach tightened as he recognized Spencer Lang's distinctive silhouette emerging from the driver's seat, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The sight of his old friend brought a complicated mixture of familiarity and unease. I need to get the door, Daniel said to Micah, ruffling his hair gently. Keep working on those multiplication tables, buddy. You're doing great. Angela, who had been preparing dinner at the counter, caught Daniel's eye. She'd heard enough about Spencer over the past few days to recognize the tension in Daniel's shoulders. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel, her movements deliberately calm despite the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Daniel reached the heavy front door just as Spencer's knuckles met the wood. Spencer, he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. This is unexpected. His hand remained on the doorframe, a subtle barrier between his past and his present. Daniel! Spencer's smile was bright and practiced like a television host's. Thought I'd drop by, check on how the estate clearing is going. He stepped past Daniel into the foyer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood. And, of course, discussed the Singapore deal. The board's getting antsy. He surveyed the entryway with the casual entitlement of someone used to being welcomed everywhere. Daniel led Spencer to the drawing room, watching as his old friend's eyes swept across the space with barely concealed judgment. Spencer's gaze lingered on Micah's colored pencils scattered across the coffee table, on Angela's nursing textbook propped open on the window seat. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like someone noticing fingerprints on a clean glass. The place looks... Spencer paused, choosing his words carefully. Lived in. He ran a finger along the edge of an antique side table as if checking for dust. Before Daniel could respond, the patter of small feet echoed from the hallway. Micah appeared in the doorway, worksheet in hand, his face bright with accomplishment. Daddy, I finished the problems. The word daddy hung in the air between the men, new and fragile. Spencer's head snapped toward Daniel, his eyebrows shooting up. Behind Micah, Angela appeared, her face carefully composed, one hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder. She wore the dignified expression Daniel had come to recognize as her armor. Spencer, Daniel said, his voice firm. I'd like you to meet Micah and his mother, Angela Carter. He moved closer to them, a subtle shift in allegiance that didn't go unnoticed. Spencer's smile turned sharp at the edges. "Ah," he said, his tone too light, too casual. "New staff?" His gaze flicked between Angela and Micah, assessing and dismissive all at once. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Angela's spine straightened, her chin lifting slightly. Daniel felt heat rise to his face, a flush of anger creeping up his neck. "No," he said coldly. "Angela and Micah are my family." The words came out with a certainty that surprised even him, as if they'd been waiting to be spoken aloud. Spencer's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened like polished stone. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Micah, why don't you go play outside while the adults talk business?" He gestured toward the garden with a flick of his manicured hand. Micah looked uncertainly between the adults, sensing the tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. Angela nodded slightly, and he slipped out through the French doors into the garden, casting one worried glance back at his mother. "I'll start dinner," Angela said quietly, her voice controlled. She left the room with practiced grace, but Daniel could see the stiffness in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself, as if bracing against an invisible wind. Spencer waited until Angela was out of earshot before turning to Daniel. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing to the garden path visible through the windows. His tone suggested this wasn't a request. Daniel followed him outside, keeping enough distance from the house to ensure privacy. Spencer stopped near an old oak tree, its branches casting dappled shadows across his expensive suit. His back was to where Micah was drawing in his sketchbook by the koi pond, the boy's small figure hunched in concentration. "Are you seriously letting the maid and her kid play house with you?" Spencer's voice was low, incredulous. "You know how this looks, right? You don't owe them your legacy just because your mom had a guilty conscience." His words were casual, as if he were discussing a minor business inconvenience rather than human beings. Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fury that rose in his chest was sudden and overwhelming, a protective rage he hadn't known himself capable of until now. But he forced his voice to stay quiet, controlled. "That's my son," he said, each word precise and sharp as glass. "That's his mother. Watch your words." His eyes never left Spencer's face, searching for any hint of understanding or remorse. Neither man noticed Angela standing in the shadowed hallway just inside the French doors, her hand pressed against the wall for support. Her face, usually so carefully controlled, had turned to stone as Spencer's words reached her ears. The familiar pain of being unseen, of being reduced, washed over her in a cold wave. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tension and forced politeness. Spencer left after an hour of clipped business discussion, but his presence seemed to linger like smoke in the air, acrid and impossible to ignore. Dinner was quiet, with Micah picking up on the adult's mood and eating without his usual chatter, his eyes darting between his mother and Daniel. After Micah went to bed, Angela disappeared upstairs. When she returned, she was carrying her suitcase, the worn blue fabric a stark contrast to the elegant surroundings. The sound of the zipper breaking the silence made Daniel look up from where he sat in the living room, his head in his hands. "I knew this would happen," Angela said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "I just didn't think it would come from someone you let in the front door." Her fingers moved methodically, folding a sweater with the same care she might fold bandages at the hospital. On the stairs, partially hidden by the banister, Micah sat watching silently as his mother zipped her suitcase closed. His small fingers gripped the wooden rails, his face a mirror of the confusion and hurt that seemed to fill the entire house. His drawing pad lay forgotten beside him, a half-finished picture of all three of them standing in front of what looked like a home. Daniel stood frozen, watching as Angela methodically packed away the life they'd begun to build. The sound of the suitcase zipper seemed to echo through the house like a final sentence, the period at the end of a story he'd only just begun to write. The morning arrived with a gentle melancholy, rain tapping against the estate's windows like hesitant fingers. Gray light filtered through the tall panes, casting soft shadows across the living room where Angela stood with her coat already buttoned, her posture rigid but dignified. Beside her, Micah shifted his weight from foot to foot, his Batman backpack slung over one small shoulder, his face a mixture of confusion and worry. Daniel stood a few feet away, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The space between them felt vast and growing wider with each passing second. "Angela, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can work this out. Spencer was wrong. I'll make sure he knows that." Angela's face remained composed, but her eyes held a deep, tired pain. "I'm not teaching Micah that love comes with humiliation," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. "That we have to shrink so someone else can stand tall." She adjusted the strap of her purse, a gesture that seemed to emphasize the finality of her decision. The rain picked up its rhythm outside, matching the heavy beating of Daniel's heart. He took a step forward, but Angela's slight headshake stopped him. "It's not just about Spencer," she continued. "It's about what he represents, the world you live in, the compromises you think we should make to fit into it." Micah clutched his sketchbook to his chest, his small fingers white against the spiral binding. His eyes darted between his parents, trying to make sense of the tension that filled the room. "But Daddy's going to read to me tonight," he said, his voice small and uncertain. "He promised we'd finish the robot story." Angela's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly at her son's words. She crouched down to his level, her hands gentle as they straightened his jacket. "We're just going back to our house, baby," she said softly. "It'll be okay." Micah's lower lip trembled as he looked at Daniel, his eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, the question piercing the air like an arrow. Daniel felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt before his son, pulling him into a tight embrace. Micah's small body felt so fragile in his arms, so precious. "Never," he whispered fiercely into Micah's curls. "This is not your fault. I love you so much." Angela looked away from the scene, her hand rising to brush quickly at her cheek. The rain continued its steady pattern against the windows, nature's quiet accompaniment to their pain. When Daniel finally released Micah, the boy's eyes were wet, but he didn't cry. He was his mother's son, already learning to hold his hurt with dignity. Angela took Micah's hand, and together they walked toward the door. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden stillness of the house. Daniel watched them go, unable to move, unable to speak. The sound of the car starting, of tires crunching on wet gravel, seemed to come from very far away. He stood there long after they'd gone, staring at the closed door as if it might open again at any moment. The day passed in a blur of gray light and silence. Daniel wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching things Micah had touched. A toy car left under the coffee table, a half-drunk glass of chocolate milk in the refrigerator, fingerprints on the window pane where he'd drawn pictures in the condensation. Evening crept in, bringing darker clouds and heavier rain. Daniel found himself in the kitchen, where just yesterday they'd all eaten breakfast together. The memory of Micah's laughter as he'd tried to catch pancake pieces in his mouth felt like it belonged to another lifetime. There on the kitchen table lay a single piece of paper, one of Micah's drawings, left behind in their hurried departure. Daniel picked it up with trembling hands. 3 figures stood holding hands under a bright yellow sun, a family portrait drawn with the bold, loving strokes of a child's hand. But where the father's face should have been, there was only an angry scribble of black crayon, obliterating the features completely. Daniel carried the drawing out into the garden, barely noticing the rain that immediately began to soak through his shirt. Water droplets fell onto the paper, making the crayon colors run together in abstract patterns. He stood there, letting the rain wash over him, staring at the faceless figure that represented all his failures. "I won't lose them again," he whispered to the empty garden, his words almost lost in the sound of falling rain. The drawing grew softer in his hands, the paper beginning to dissolve under the steady downpour, but he couldn't let it go. Like the family it depicted, he held on even as it threatened to fall apart. The rain continued to fall, running down his face like tears he couldn't shed, soaking into the drawing until the 3 figures began to blur together: mother, father, and child, becoming indistinct in the growing darkness of the evening. 3 days had passed since Angela and Micah left, and the estate felt like it was slowly sinking into darkness. Daniel moved through the rooms like a shadow, leaving most lights off, letting the gray days bleed into darker nights. The silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the occasional creak of old floorboards or the distant sound of wind in the magnolia trees. He sat at his father's old desk, staring at his laptop screen where a blank email draft had been open for hours. The cursor blinked steadily, mocking his inability to find the right words. Every attempt felt hollow or desperate or both. Angela's words kept echoing in his mind. "I'm not teaching Micah that love comes with humiliation." The truth of it stung more with each passing hour. Spencer's tech proposal lay untouched on the corner of the desk, growing dusty. Daniel couldn't bring himself to look at it, knowing it represented everything that had driven Angela away. The paperwork might as well have been written in a foreign language now. The numbers and projections seemed meaningless compared to the weight of what he'd lost. Around noon, Daniel found himself reaching for his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed Micah's school, rehearsing his excuse in his head. When the secretary connected him to Micah's teacher, he cleared his throat. "This is Daniel Whitmore, Micah's father. I wanted to check about his project materials. The volcano demonstration?" The teacher's voice softened with recognition. "Oh, yes. Actually, I'm glad you called. Micah's been different these past few days. Very quiet. He's been drawing a lot during free time. Mostly houses, but they're not his usual happy drawings. They seem sad somehow. Empty." She paused, then added gently, "Children often express their feelings through art." Daniel's throat tightened. He thanked her quickly and ended the call, the knowledge of Micah's sadness settling heavily in his chest. Later that afternoon, he found himself driving past Angela's apartment building on the east side of town. It was a modest complex, well-maintained but simple, with a small playground visible from the street. Daniel slowed the car, scanning the windows, wondering which one belonged to them. A child's bicycle was chained to a rack near the entrance. Was it Micah's? His hand hovered over the gear shift, tempted to park, to walk up and knock. But he couldn't. The fear gripped him, not of Angela turning him away, but of making things worse, of causing more pain to the two people he'd finally learned to love. He drove on, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Back at the estate, Daniel found himself in his mother's study, pulling out old photo albums he hadn't touched in years. Dust scattered as he opened them, revealing pages of carefully preserved memories. Near the back, he found what he was looking for, the only printed photograph he had of himself as a child. In it, he wore a cape made from a bedsheet, arms raised in a triumphant pose, gap-toothed smile beaming at the camera. With trembling fingers, he placed the photo next to Micah's drawing of them as superheroes. The similarity was striking, painful even. The same determined set of the jaw, the same creative spark in their eyes. Daniel traced the lines of Micah's drawing, remembering how his son's face had lit up while creating it. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster as his heart took over from his hesitant mind. This wasn't for Angela. This was for Micah, and somehow that made it easier. His handwriting, usually precise and controlled, became looser as his emotions flowed onto the page. "Dear Micah," he wrote, "I know things are confusing right now. I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and my biggest mistake was not being there for you from the beginning. But I'm here now, and I always will be." He paused, pen hovering over the paper, then continued. "You don't have to call me Dad, but I'll always show up like one. I'll always be proud of your drawings and your ideas and your kind heart. I'll always want to build robots with you and read stories and learn about what makes you happy." The letter went on, filling the page with promises and memories and hope. When he finished, Daniel read it over, noting the ink smudges where his hand had shaken, the places where words had been crossed out and rewritten. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. He looked at the clock. Late afternoon was sliding into evening. Moving with sudden purpose, Daniel went to his workshop in the garage. There, on a shelf, sat the model rocket kit he'd bought for them to build together. It was still in its box, wrapped in clear cellophane, waiting for a moment that never came. Daniel found a sturdy mailing box and carefully packed the rocket kit, cushioning it with bubble wrap. He slipped the letter inside, then sealed the package with careful precision. On the front, he wrote Micah's name in large, clear block letters, making each one as neat as possible. The drive to Angela's apartment building felt both too long and too short. The evening was settling in, casting long shadows between the buildings. Daniel parked across the street, the package heavy in his hands as he crossed to the entrance. He could see warm light in some of the windows above, hear the distant sound of children playing somewhere inside. Standing before their door, Daniel placed the package carefully on the welcome mat. His fingers lingered on the corner for a moment, reluctant to let go. Then he straightened up and walked away, not allowing himself to ring the bell or knock. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he left, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say out loud. Later that evening, Angela found the package propped against their apartment door when she returned from her nursing shift. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the careful block letters spelling out Micah's name. She picked it up, surprised by its weight, and carried it inside. Micah looked up from his homework at the kitchen table, his eyes widening at the sight of the box. "Is that for me?" Angela nodded, setting it down in front of him. She watched as he carefully peeled back the tape, his small fingers working with deliberate precision. The bubble wrap crinkled as he reached inside, pulling out the rocket kit first. His eyes lit up, but there was something careful in his excitement, like he was afraid to feel too much joy. Then he found the letter. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind Angela remembered from the estate's writing desk. Micah unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving across the words. Angela stood very still, watching his face as he read. She could see Daniel's handwriting from where she stood, the usually precise letters looking somehow more human, more vulnerable. Micah read the whole thing twice, his fingers tracing some of the words. When he finally looked up at Angela, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Can I go home now?" he whispered, his voice small but clear in the quiet apartment. Angela felt her chest tighten. She looked around their apartment, the cramped but cozy space they'd made their own over the years. The walls were covered with Micah's artwork, the furniture was worn but comfortable, and every corner held memories of their life together. But now, seeing the longing in her son's eyes, she understood that home had become something bigger than these four walls. She sat down beside him, pulling him close. "That is our home," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "But we'll figure it out." Micah leaned into her, clutching the letter and the rocket kit to his chest. That night, after Micah had finally fallen asleep, Angela couldn't find rest. She tossed and turned in her bed, Daniel's words to their son echoing in her mind. Finally, she got up, wrapped herself in a thick blanket, and stepped out onto their small balcony. The night air was cool against her face as she looked up at the stars. They were harder to see here in the city than they had been at the estate, but they were there. Tiny pinpricks of light in the vast darkness. The sight triggered a memory so vivid it took her breath away. 7 years ago, she and Daniel had laid on a blanket under the estate's massive oak tree, looking up at these same stars. The night had been perfect, crickets chirping softly, the air heavy with the scent of magnolias. Daniel had turned to her, his face young and full of dreams, and whispered, "What if we just stayed like this forever?" She had laughed then, the sound full of youth and hope and endless possibilities. Now, standing alone on her balcony, Angela felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't bother wiping them away. The memory ached, but it wasn't just pain she felt anymore. There was something else there too, something that felt like hope, or maybe forgiveness. The next morning, Angela woke to find Micah already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table. His sketchbook was open in front of him, and the rocket kit sat carefully arranged beside it. He looked up as she entered, his face set with determination. "I want to show Daddy my new drawing," he said simply. Angela paused in the middle of reaching for the coffee maker. She looked at her son, really looked at him. He was wearing his favorite blue shirt, the one he said made him look like a scientist. His hair was carefully combed and his eyes held that quiet wisdom that sometimes startled her. She sighed, but there was a softness to it. "Let me call first," she said, reaching for her phone. But Micah was already gathering his things, as if he knew what her answer would be before she did. The drive to the estate felt both familiar and strange. The morning sun cast long shadows across the road, and Micah sat quietly in the back seat, holding his sketchbook like it contained something precious. Angela's hands were steady on the steering wheel, but her heart raced as they turned onto the long gravel driveway. The house looked different somehow, less imposing, more like a place waiting to be filled with life again. Angela parked near the front steps, taking a deep breath before helping Micah out of the car. They walked up to the door together, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Angela knocked, the sound echoing in the morning quiet. There was a moment of stillness, then the sound of hurried footsteps from inside. The door opened, and there was Daniel, still in his pajamas, hair mussed from sleep, eyes wide with shock as he took in the sight of them standing there. Micah didn't wait for anyone to speak. He simply held up his sketchbook, opening it to his newest drawing. The page showed 3 figures standing in front of the big house, drawn with the careful detail that Micah put into all his important work. But it was the words above the picture that made Angela's breath catch, written in bright, bold colors. Ours, Micah's house. The evening settled over the estate like a soft blanket, bringing with it the familiar symphony of cicadas and crickets. The warm summer air carried the lingering scent of the dinner they'd shared, pasta with garlic bread that Daniel had managed not to burn this time. Upstairs, Micah slept soundly, the model rocket tucked safely in his arms like a treasured companion. Angela sat on the wide back porch, her bare feet pressed against the cool wooden boards. The white wicker chair creaked softly as she shifted, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Daniel emerged from the house carrying 2 wine glasses and a bottle of red wine that had been gathering dust in his mother's cellar. "I think this one's actually meant to be drunk, not just admired," he said, a hint of his old humor returning as he held up the bottle. Angela's lips curved into a small smile. "As long as it's not that awful sweet wine your mother used to serve at garden parties." "God, no," Daniel chuckled, pouring them each a generous glass. "I think she only served that to people she didn't like." The casual mention of his mother didn't sting like it used to. Instead, it felt like touching an old scar, present but no longer painful. Angela accepted the wine glass, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. For the first time since she'd returned, the air between them felt clear, uncluttered by the weight of their past. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds and sipping their wine. It was almost like before, when they were just Daniel and Angela, 2 young people who found each other in this very garden. Almost, but not quite. They were different now, shaped by 7 years of separate lives and hard-learned lessons. "Tell me," Daniel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what it was like." Angela took a long sip of wine, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady but heavy with memory. "It was hard. Harder than I ever imagined it could be. Not just the practical things, though God knows those were difficult enough. Working double shifts at the hospital, trying to finish nursing school, finding babysitters who wouldn't judge." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. "But it was the other things that really wore me down. The assumptions people made. The way they'd look at me in the grocery store, counting the items in my cart like they were tallying up my worth. The whispers about another welfare case even though I never took a dime of public assistance." Daniel listened intently, his face illuminated by the soft porch light. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer solutions or explanations. He just let her words fill the space between them. "When Micah was 4, Angela continued, her voice catching slightly, "I took him to a department store to buy new shoes. He was so excited. They had these light-up sneakers he'd been begging for. But I noticed a security guard following us, just hovering, watching my 4-year-old baby like he was some kind of threat." She took another sip of wine, steadying herself. That night I had to start teaching him things. Things you probably never had to think about at his age. How to keep his hands visible in stores. How to speak softly and move carefully in certain spaces. How to handle being the only brown face in a room full of white ones. Daniel's knuckles were white around his wine glass, but his voice remained gentle. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Not just now, but always. Tell me how to do this right." Angela turned to look at him fully, her eyes bright in the dim light. "I need to be seen without having to explain myself every time. To be loved out loud, not just in secret places and quiet gardens. I need Micah to grow up knowing his father will stand beside him, not behind him or in front of him. Then let me learn how," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to learn everything. The hard parts, the scary parts, all of it. I want to understand what you both need." He reached across the space between their chairs, his hand open in invitation. Angela looked at it for a long moment, remembering all the times they'd held hands in this same garden, young and naive and full of impossible dreams. But this wasn't that kind of moment. This was something new, something built on truth and hard-won wisdom rather than just hope. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. His fingers were warm against her skin, and he held her hand like it was something precious, but not fragile. They sat like that, connected but not speaking, as the night deepened around them. After what could have been minutes or hours, Angela leaned over and rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. The position was familiar, but the feeling was different, more solid, more real. Above them, the porch light flickered, casting dancing shadows across the wooden boards, but neither of them noticed. They were home again, but this time, they were home with their eyes wide open. The morning sun filtered through the estate's ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows across the dewy grass. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, fidgeting with a small wooden box while watching Micah demolish his second bowl of Cheerios. The boy's feet swung rhythmically under the table, his SpongeBob socks a blur of yellow against the dark wood floors. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, clearing his throat. "Can we talk about something important?" Micah looked up, milk dripping from his spoon. His eyes fixed on the box in Daniel's hands, curiosity lighting up his face. "Is it a present?" "Sort of." Daniel's voice was gentle but serious. He placed the box between them on the table, his hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "It's actually more like a promise." Micah put down his spoon, giving Daniel his full attention. For a 6-year-old, he had an uncanny ability to read the weight of moments. Daniel opened the box slowly, revealing a brass key nestled in dark velvet. It caught the morning light, gleaming like treasure. "This is a special key," he explained. "It's for the treehouse out back." "The broken one?" Micah's eyes widened. "Well, right now it's not much of anything," Daniel admitted with a small smile. "But I was thinking, maybe we could build it together. Make it into something amazing. With slides and secret compartments and whatever else you can dream up. But only if you want me to help. Only if you'll let me be part of building it with you and your mom." Micah stared at the key, his face scrunched in serious consideration. The moment stretched, filled only with the distant sound of birds and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Then, like sunshine breaking through clouds, his face split into a brilliant grin. "Okay," he exclaimed, bouncing in his seat. "But I want a slide, a big curvy one, and a rope ladder, and maybe a telescope for looking at stars." Daniel laughed, relief and joy mingling in his chest. "We can definitely work on that. Want to go look at the spot right now?" "Yes!" Micah jumped up, nearly knocking over his cereal bowl in his excitement. He snatched the key from the box and clutched it like it was made of gold. Through the kitchen window, Angela watched from her spot on the back porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the way Micah's face lit up, the careful tenderness in Daniel's movements. Something warm and fragile bloomed in her chest. Later that morning, after Micah had run outside to inspect every inch of the old oak tree, Daniel approached Angela on the porch. His steps were measured, deliberate. In his hands was another small box, this one covered in dark blue velvet. Angela's breath caught. She knew what this was. Daniel didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand gesture or speech. Instead, he simply sat beside her on the porch swing and opened the box between them. Inside, a ring caught the morning light, elegant but not flashy, with a single diamond nestled between two smaller sapphires. "Not out of guilt," he said softly, his voice steady and sure. "Not because it's what people expect or because the timing seems right. This is out of love, pure and simple and complicated and real. But you don't have to say yes, not yet, not until you're ready." Angela stared at the ring, her heart thundering in her chest. She could feel the weight of their history, the ghost of past hurts, but also the strength of what they'd built these past weeks. The laughter in the kitchen, the quiet talks on this very porch, the way Micah's drawings now showed 3 people instead of 2. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and closed the box. But before disappointment could settle on Daniel's face, she placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. "Let's build the house first," she said softly. "The one where love gets to live, the one where we all fit exactly as we are." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes, followed by something that looked like hope. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "I think someone's waiting for us to start on his treehouse." As if on cue, Micah's voice carried across the yard. "Daddy! Mommy! Come look! I found the perfect branch for the slide." They walked together to the backyard, where the old oak tree spread its massive branches against the blue summer sky. The remnants of an old treehouse platform clung to its trunk, weathered boards telling stories of decades past. Micah had already scrambled halfway up the ladder, his new key dangling from a string around his neck. Daniel lifted a box of supplies they'd gathered that morning: wood, rope, basic tools. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, ready for work. He looked different here in the sunshine, Angela thought. More like the boy she'd first fallen in love with, but tempered now with the strength of the man he'd become. Angela tilted her head back, watching father and son laugh together in the dappled shade of oak leaves. Micah was gesturing wildly, describing his vision for the treehouse, while Daniel nodded seriously at each suggestion. They looked so natural together, as if the years of separation had somehow melted away in the warm summer air. "We're going to need a pulley system," Micah declared, "and for sending up snacks and stuff." "Smart thinking," Daniel agreed. "Maybe we can design it together?" Angela watched them, her heart full and aching in the best way. "We're not fixing the past," she whispered to herself, the words carrying on the gentle breeze. "We're writing the future." The late summer breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and sawdust through the estate grounds. Where silence had once ruled, the air now hummed with life. Children's laughter echoed from the newly finished treehouse where Micah's hand-painted sign swayed gently. "Micah's house, no bullies allowed," written in bright, determined letters. Angela walked slowly through the renovated guest house, her fingers trailing along the freshly painted walls. The space had been transformed from a dusty relic into something bright and purposeful. Large windows flooded the rooms with natural light, highlighting the comfortable furniture and welcoming decor. Resource pamphlets sat neatly arranged on a coffee table, and a small play area in the corner was stocked with children's books and toys. Daniel followed a few steps behind her, watching as she took in every detail. The wellness center had been her vision, a safe space for single Black mothers to find support, resources, and community. 2 local nurses, Sarah and Maya, had already signed on as partners, bringing years of experience and genuine passion to the project. "The first session is next week," Angela said softly, adjusting a frame on the wall. "I still can't believe how quickly it's coming together." "People want to help," Daniel replied. "The donations keep coming in. That local medical supply company called again. They want to provide all the basic health screening equipment." Angela nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. "We've already got 15 mothers signed up for the initial support group. Sarah's handling the prenatal care workshops, and Maya's organizing the childcare rotation." She paused by the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds. "It's really happening." The sound of small feet thundering down the treehouse ladder drew their attention. Micah was racing across the lawn, waving a stack of papers. "Mom! Dad! The flyers are done!" Daniel caught him as he burst through the door, scooping him up with practiced ease. Micah proudly displayed his contribution. He had decorated the borders of each flyer with carefully drawn hearts and stars. "Perfect," Angela smiled, taking one to examine. "These will definitely catch people's attention." Later that morning, Daniel sat in his attorney's office, the leather chair creaking as he leaned forward to sign the documents. The will had been updated, making everything official. Micah was now legally recognized as his son, with all the protections and provisions that entailed. Angela's name had been added to a property trust, ensuring her stake in the estate and the wellness center. "She never asked for any of this," Daniel said quietly, watching the attorney file away the papers. The older man smiled knowingly. "That's why it's hers," he replied, his tone warm with understanding. That evening, the kitchen came alive with domestic sounds that would have been unimaginable just months ago. Daniel stood at the stove, stirring a pot of his grandmother's pasta sauce, his first attempt at cooking since Angela and Micah had returned. The recipe card was worn and stained, but the familiar scents brought back memories of warmer times. Micah moved around the kitchen with careful concentration, setting the table just as Angela had taught him. 3 plates, 3 sets of silverware, 3 napkins folded into triangles. He hummed along to the jazz music floating from Angela's old record player, a piece by John Coltrane that filled the house with mellow warmth. "How's the sauce looking, Chef?" Angela asked, peeking over Daniel's shoulder. "Well, it's definitely red," he laughed, offering her a taste from the wooden spoon. She nodded appreciatively. "Your grandmother would be proud." Micah climbed onto his chair, knees pulled up under him as he reached for the garlic bread. "Can we put a nameplate on the treehouse?" he asked between bites. "I thought of the perfect name." "Oh yeah?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What's your idea?" "The Rocket Tower," Micah announced proudly. "Because you build rockets, Dad, and towers are like houses but cooler." Angela laughed, the sound mixing perfectly with the jazz notes floating through the air. "That's actually pretty perfect," she admitted. They talked through dinner about everyday things. Micah's upcoming science fair project, whether the guest bathroom should be painted sage green or robin's egg blue, and if the treehouse needed curtains for its windows. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. After dinner, Daniel followed Micah upstairs for their nightly reading ritual. The boys' room had slowly accumulated personal touches, rocket models hanging from the ceiling, drawings taped to the walls, and a collection of minerals on the windowsill. They settled into the reading chair, Micah clutching his favorite space exploration book. As Daniel read about distant galaxies and shooting stars, he felt Micah growing heavier against his chest. The boy's eyes began to drift closed, his breathing becoming slow and steady. "You came back, Daddy," Micah mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Daniel's heart clenched. He pressed a gentle kiss to his son's forehead. "I never should have left," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of years of regret and newfound promise. Downstairs, Angela stood at the French doors leading to the garden. The solar-powered lights in the treehouse had just blinked on, casting a warm glow through the branches of the old oak tree. It had been Micah's idea to use solar power, because it's better for the planet, Mom. She watched the lights twinkle against the darkening sky, thinking about how much had changed. The estate no longer felt like a monument to the past or a symbol of exclusion. Instead, it had become something new. A home, a sanctuary, a place of healing not just for their family, but for others who needed it too. The house had transformed just as they had. It wasn't just Daniel's inheritance anymore, or a painful reminder of what had been lost. It belonged to all of them now. Every painted wall, every creaking floorboard, every corner filled with new memories and possibilities. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the estate's backyard, where colorful balloons bobbed in the gentle breeze and the remnants of birthday cake dotted paper plates scattered across picnic tables. A year had transformed the once silent property into a vibrant celebration of life and laughter. as children darted between games and decorations hand-painted with rockets and stars. The wellness center, now a cornerstone of the community, hummed with activity even on weekends. Angela's leadership had turned it into more than just a support center. It was a place of empowerment and connection. Her community workshops drew women from across 3 counties, creating a network of support that grew stronger with each passing month. Daniel's tech company had evolved too, shaped by his new understanding of family and purpose. Code My World, the free education app he'd developed with Micah's enthusiastic input, was already helping thousands of children learn coding basics. He'd smiled when Micah had suggested the name, remembering how his son's perspective had helped him see everything differently. Up in the treehouse, now officially known as the Rocket Tower, Micah perched near the window with 2 of his school friends, Tommy and Marcus. His eyes sparkled with pride as he pointed down at his parents, who were mingling with the party guests below. "That's my mommy," he declared, his chest puffing up slightly. "She's the boss. She helps lots of other mommies too." He grinned and shifted his finger to indicate Daniel. "And that's my dad. He burns pancakes, but he's really good at building stuff." The boys giggled at the pancake comment and Micah beamed. His world had expanded in the past year, filled with the certainty of belonging and the joy of sharing his family with others. Near the garden, where fresh roses climbed newly installed trellises, Angela stood with a small group of mothers from her support network. She wore a sundress in deep purple, her braids crowned with a thin gold band that caught the sunlight. Her laugh carried across the yard, free and unguarded. Lisa, one of the regular workshop participants, leaned close to Angela's ear. "You're lucky, you know," she said softly, watching Daniel help a younger child retrieve a balloon that had gotten stuck in a tree. "He really sees you." Angela's expression softened as she watched Daniel lift the little girl onto his shoulders to reach the balloon. "He learned how," she replied, her voice warm with memory and appreciation. "We all did." The afternoon light was beginning to soften when Daniel called everyone to gather on the wide porch. He stood on the top step, his casual button-down rolled to the elbows, looking more at ease than anyone who knew him from before would have believed possible. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. Then he reached down and lifted Micah into his arms, the boy's party crown slightly askew. "This house is full because of him. He reminded us what family feels like." Micah grabbed the microphone from his father's hand, earning chuckles from the crowd. "Also because I said so," he announced, with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old birthday boy. Laughter rippled through the gathering, warm and genuine. Angela caught Daniel's eye across the space between them, sharing a private smile that spoke of all the moments that had led them here. As the sun began to set, guests slowly departed with hugs and leftover cake. The yard grew quiet, though evidence of the celebration remained: deflating balloons, scattered streamers, and the string lights that had been strung through the trees now glowing like earthbound stars. Micah had fallen asleep on the porch swing, clutching his new robot building kit, exhausted from the excitement of his perfect day. Angela carefully carried him up to bed, tucking him in among his space-themed sheets and glow-in-the-dark stars. When she came back downstairs, Daniel was waiting by the French doors. He held out his hand, a gentle invitation in his eyes. "Walk with me?" He led her to the koi pond, restored now to its former glory, and enhanced with floating lilies that opened their petals to the evening air. The water reflected the string lights above, creating a magical atmosphere of floating stars both above and below. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, the one Angela had found in the library so long ago, showing them laughing by the garden fence in what felt like another lifetime. The edges were soft from handling, but the joy captured in that moment remained clear and true. Finally, after all the steps that had led them here, Daniel lowered himself to one knee. This wasn't a gesture of rescue or redemption. Those narratives had long since been replaced by something far more real. This was simply love grown strong through understanding and choice. "I missed a lifetime with you," he said softly, his voice steady with certainty. "But I want every tomorrow." Angela looked at the pond, where koi fish moved like living shadows beneath the lily pads. She lifted her gaze to the stars emerging in the darkening sky, then finally to Daniel's face. The face she'd learned to trust again, not despite their past, but because of how they'd rebuilt their future. "Let's go home," she said. They walked back toward the house together, their hands intertwined, their silhouettes merging in the warm glow spilling from the windows of Micah's house. Behind them, the string lights twinkled like promises kept, while ahead, the home they'd built together waited to welcome them back inside. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel and Angela, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel and Angela, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.